She was not supposed to survive that night, and the woman who tried to make sure of it was sitting at the breakfast table the next morning, wearing her jewelry, eating her food, and sleeping in her bed. All while Vivienne lay unconscious on a hospital floor with a tube in her arm and machines beeping around her on what was supposed to be the most beautiful morning of her life. If you have ever been betrayed by someone who smiled at you every single day while destroying you from the inside, stay right where you are. Because this story is going to show you exactly what that kind of evil looks like, exactly how far it will go, and exactly what happens when it finally meets its match. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Vivienne grew up in a small town in rural Georgia, the kind of town where everybody knew your grandmother's name and your business traveled faster than the wind. Her mother died of a stroke when Vivienne was 7 years old. She remembered almost nothing of her except the smell of her hair and the sound she made while humming over the kitchen sink on Sunday mornings. That hum was the thing Vivienne held onto the longest. It was the last warm thing she remembered before the cold moved in. Her father, Raymond, was a quiet and gentle man who had worked at a grain mill for 30 years without complaint. He was not a wealthy man by any measure, but he owned his home outright, a solid 3-bedroom house on a half-acre lot that his own father had built with his bare hands in 1951. Raymond treated that house like a living thing. He repainted the porch every spring. He fixed every crack before it became a problem. He told Vivienne from the time she was small that the house would one day belong to her. He said it like a promise. He meant it like one too. When Vivienne was 12 years old, Raymond married Dolores. Dolores was 41. She was sharp-tongued and immaculately dressed, and she smiled the way a trap smiles, wide open, patient, waiting. She had a daughter of her own named Shayla, who was 10, and from the very first week in that house, Dolores made it understood without ever saying a single word out loud exactly where Vivienne stood. She cooked dinner for Raymond and Shayla and left nothing on the stove for Vivienne. She bought new school clothes for Shayla every August and handed Vivienne a garbage bag of Shayla's cast-offs and called it generosity. She told Raymond that Vivienne was difficult, ungrateful, a troubled child who needed firm handling. She delivered these assessments softly, sadly, like a woman at the very end of her patience. And Raymond, who was a good man but a weak one in the ways that mattered most, believed her every single time. Vivienne learned quickly. She woke up every morning before the rest of the house and washed the dishes and swept the floor so Dolores could not find fault with the kitchen. She kept her room so clean you could eat off the floor. She brought home straight A grades because staying in school was the only guaranteed way to get out of that house for 8 hours a day. She made herself invisible, small, unbothered, unreadable. She had figured out very early that Dolores fed on other people's pain the way ordinary people feed on praise. So she gave her nothing. She kept her face still and her voice even, and she endured. She left for college on an academic scholarship at 18 years old, and she never moved back home. She built a life quietly and on her own terms. She earned a degree. She got a job as a records administrator at a hospital in Atlanta. She rented a small apartment with good light, and she filled it with books and plants and the kind of quiet that felt like choice instead of punishment. She was not unhappy. She was careful. There is a difference. She was 34 years old when she met Marcus Webb at a mutual friend's cookout on a Sunday afternoon in July. He was an electrician from Charlotte, broad-shouldered and unhurried, with a slow, easy laugh and hands that looked like they knew how to fix things. He looked at Vivienne the way no one had ever quite looked at her before, like she was exactly the right amount of everything, and he was in absolutely no rush to look away. They dated for 2 years. Careful years, honest ones, the kind where you find out who a person actually is instead of who they perform being. He proposed on an ordinary Tuesday evening while she was standing at her kitchen stove making soup. No restaurant, no audience, no grand gesture. Just him, in her kitchen, on one knee, with a ring and a completely unguarded face. She said yes before he finished the sentence. The wedding planning began immediately. Vivienne threw herself into every detail with the focused energy of a woman who had spent a lifetime being told she did not deserve things and had decided very quietly that those days were over. This wedding was not about fantasy for her. She had not spent her childhood dreaming of a white dress. She had spent her childhood surviving. So this was about proof. Proof that she had made it through. Proof that she was loved out loud in front of people on record. Proof that the girl who ate leftover scraps at the table of a woman who despised her had become someone worth 214 people getting dressed up for. Marcus paid for the majority of the costs. Vivienne contributed every dollar she had saved from 3 years of overtime shifts. Then, 8 months before the wedding, her father called. His voice was thin and tired in a way she had not heard before. He told her he had been diagnosed with stage 3 kidney disease. He said the doctors were cautiously optimistic, but he wanted to see her more. He said he wanted to enjoy her company while he still felt well enough to enjoy anything. Vivienne began making the drive back to Georgia every 3rd weekend. This was the moment Dolores had been waiting for. Every time Vivienne came home, Dolores was warm, welcoming. She cooked the meals Vivienne had loved as a child, before the marriage, back when Raymond cooked them himself. She asked questions about the wedding with what appeared to be real enthusiasm. She offered to help address envelopes, coordinate with aunts, call the caterer. She fussed over color swatches. She cried a little at the sight of the dress photographs. She was performing the role of a loving stepmother with the commitment and precision of a woman who had been rehearsing it for 22 years. Vivienne was not fooled. But her father was so visibly happy to see them together, so relieved, so lit up by the idea that his 2 families had finally made peace, that Vivienne let it continue. She told herself it did not matter. 6 months. 5 months. 4. She just had to get through to the other side of this wedding and then she could breathe. What Vivienne did not know was what was happening behind the warmth. Dolores had found a lawyer. Not a family lawyer. A real estate attorney with a specialty in asset transfers and a reputation for creative paperwork. Raymond's health was declining faster than the initial prognosis suggested. He was having trouble with concentration, trouble tracking paperwork, trouble remembering the details of conversations he had just had. Dolores had positioned herself as his caretaker and his organizer, the person who now accompanied him to every doctor's appointment and every meeting at the bank and every conversation with anyone who might need Raymond to sign anything at all. 3 months before the wedding, Raymond signed a document that Dolores told him was a supplemental insurance form. It was not an insurance form. It was a property transfer document. The house that Raymond's father had built. The house Raymond had promised to Vivienne since she was a small girl. The house that was the only real asset Raymond had ever accumulated in his entire life. It was transferred, in full, into Dolores's name alone. Raymond did not know what he had signed. His vision was poor and his trust was absolute. Dolores knew exactly what she had done. She had planned it across months. She had timed it precisely. She had executed it with the cold, patient efficiency of someone who had been waiting for the right moment for a very long time. And she felt nothing about it except satisfaction. But even that was not enough for her. One Saturday afternoon, 6 weeks before the wedding, Vivienne arrived at the house for one of her regular visits. She had barely set her bag down when Dolores appeared in the kitchen doorway, arms folded, chin lifted, wearing an expression Vivienne had not seen on her face in months. The performance was over. The warmth was gone. What was underneath it had always been there, and now it was simply standing in the room without a costume on. Dolores looked at her for a long moment and then she spoke. She said, "You think you are something now, do you not? You think because some man put a ring on your finger you have arrived somewhere." She laughed once, short and cold. "You are still the same nothing you were when you came into this house. A motherless little girl with nowhere to go and nobody who truly wanted you. Your father took you in out of obligation, not love. And that man you are marrying," she said, "he does not know you yet. But he will find out, same as everyone does, that there is nothing behind that quiet of yours except damage." Vivienne stood very still. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She looked at Dolores the way she had learned to look at her at 12 years old, with a face that gave nothing away and eyes that recorded everything. She picked up her bag. She said, "I will be back next weekend to see my father." And she walked out of that house. She sat in her car at the end of the street for 10 minutes. Her hands were pressed flat on her thighs. She breathed through it until the shaking stopped. Then she drove back to Atlanta. She did not tell Marcus what Dolores had said. She did not want those words in their space. But she wrote them down in a notebook she kept in her bedside drawer, word for word, exactly as they were delivered, with the date beside them. She did not know yet why she was writing it down. She only knew that she had been in this woman's presence long enough to understand that you document everything. You document it and you keep it and you wait. If the story is gripping you right now, go ahead and hit that like button. Subscribe if you have not already, because every week on Fireside Tales we bring you stories exactly like this one. And share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Now let us get back to Vivienne, because what happens next is something you will not believe. The rehearsal dinner was held on a Friday evening at a rented hall with round tables and fairy lights, and the smell of good food filling every corner. It was loud and warm and full of people who loved Vivienne and Marcus and were not afraid to show it. Raymond sat at the head table in his best suit, the navy blue one Vivienne had helped him pick out, and he told the story of the day Vivienne was born with so much detail and tenderness that half the room was crying before he finished. Marcus's mother reached across the table and held Vivienne's hand. Vivienne's Aunt Cecilia laughed so hard she had to press a napkin to her face. Dolores sat beside Raymond and smiled and refilled glasses and said all the right things to all the right people. She was gracious. She was warm. She was the picture of a devoted wife and a proud stepmother welcoming a son-in-law into the family. Nobody at that table could have imagined what she had already set in motion. After dinner, Vivienne went back to her hotel room. Marcus stayed the night at his brother's house, tradition. Aunt Cecilia stayed with Vivienne to help her get ready in the morning. They stayed up past midnight talking and laughing, and when they finally settled down to sleep, Vivienne lay in the dark feeling something she had not felt in a very long time, which was peace. Uncomplicated, unguarded peace. She let herself have it. Tomorrow she was getting married. At 11:15 there was a knock at the hotel room door. Dolores was standing in the hallway in a silk blouse and heels, holding a small decorative gift bag tied with a ribbon. She was smiling. She said she could not sleep. She said she kept thinking about Vivienne and how nervous she must be, and she wanted to bring her a little something. She said it was a calming tonic, herbal, completely natural. She said she had discovered it years ago, and she wished someone had thought to give her something like it on her own wedding eve. Vivienne did not want to take it. Every instinct she had was saying no. But Aunt Cecilia was right there, sitting up in the bed behind her, watching with a warm smile, and the last thing Vivienne wanted on the eve of her wedding was a scene with this woman. A confrontation that would require explaining, that would reach Raymond's ears and dampen the morning. She took the bag. She thanked Dolores. Dolores squeezed her hand and left. Vivienne set the bag on the nightstand without opening it. At 2 in the morning she was still awake. Her mind would not stop moving. She was running through the ceremony in her head, the vows she had written, the way she wanted her voice to sound when she said them. She thought about her father's face when he saw her in the dress. She thought about Marcus waiting at the end of that aisle. She reached for the bag on the nightstand. She told herself one small sip of something herbal could not possibly hurt. She opened the bottle and drank half of it before she set it back down. 40 minutes later she was shaking. Her vision was pulling at the edges like a curtain being drawn. Her hands were not responding the way hands should respond. Her heart was doing something alarming and irregular. She tried to stand and her legs did not cooperate. She woke Aunt Cecilia with as much voice as she could manage. Cecilia took one look at her and called an ambulance. Vivienne arrived at the emergency room at 3:47 in the morning in her pajamas, vomiting, her heart rate spiking and dropping in patterns that made the attending nurses move very quickly and speak in low, urgent voices. The toxicology panel came back within the hour. There was a pharmaceutical-grade sedative compound in her system. Not an herbal supplement. Not a natural remedy. A prescription-strength sedative that is used in controlled clinical settings and is not available in any store that sells wellness products. It had been dissolved into the liquid of that bottle carefully, deliberately, in a dosage calculated to render her completely incapacitated without being immediately identifiable as poisoning. Whoever had done this had done their research. The wedding did not happen. Marcus sat in the hospital waiting room for 6 hours in his rehearsal dinner clothes. He did not go home. He did not sleep. He sat in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights and waited for someone to come and tell him that the woman he was going to marry was going to be all right. Dolores did not come to the hospital. While Vivienne was being monitored in a room at the end of a hospital corridor, Dolores drove back to Raymond's house, changed every lock on every door, and dragged Vivienne's childhood belongings out of the house in garbage bags and left them at the curb in the dark. When Raymond was told what had happened to Vivienne, he did not believe it at first. He shook his head slowly and said there had to be a mistake. He said his wife would not do such a thing. He said Vivienne must have taken something herself without realizing. He said the doctors must be confused about the source. Dolores stood at his bedside and cried beautifully. She said she had brought that tonic as a gift from love and nothing else. She said she had bought it at a natural health store and had no idea what was actually in it. She said Vivienne had always carried a deep hostility toward her, and that this was simply the result of years of a bitter stepdaughter looking for ways to cause damage to a woman who had only ever tried to hold the family together. She delivered all of it with tears running down her face and her hand resting gently on Raymond's arm. And Raymond, who was sick and frightened and exhausted and entirely dependent on this woman for his daily survival, went quiet. Vivienne stood in the doorway of her father's room and watched his silence and understood it completely. He was not choosing Dolores over her. He was choosing to keep breathing over fighting a battle he did not have the strength left to win. She could see that. She could even understand it. It did not hurt any less. She turned around and walked out of that hospital. She sat in the parking lot in her car and she cried for exactly 1 hour. She cried the way she had taught herself to cry at 12 years old, without sound, completely alone with the windows up. Then she stopped. She wiped her face. She straightened in her seat. She started the engine. And she drove to the police station. The detective assigned to the case was a woman named Sergeant Patricia Holloway. 52 years old, 26 years on the force, the kind of woman who had heard every version of every story and had learned to listen for the thing underneath the words. She listened to Vivienne for 2 hours without interrupting once. Then she looked at the hospital toxicology report for a long time. Then she picked up the phone. The bottle had been saved. Vivienne had held on to it without quite knowing why. Some instinct, some part of her that had grown up learning to document and preserve and protect herself because no one else was going to do it. The same part of her that had written Dolores's cruel words in a notebook with a date beside them. That part of her had kept the bottle. The lab results came back in 11 days. The compound in that bottle was a pharmaceutical sedative. It had been dissolved into the liquid intentionally. The concentration was precise. The result was not an accident, and it was not a coincidence, and it was not explainable by anything other than deliberate action by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly what they wanted it to accomplish. Sergeant Holloway pulled Dolores's financial records. 3 weeks before the wedding, Dolores had made 2 cash withdrawals totaling $1,200 in bills. For days before the wedding, her cell phone had been in repeated contact with a number registered to a man with a prior conviction for pharmaceutical fraud. The case assembled itself like a puzzle where every piece had been placed in position long before anyone knew there was a puzzle to solve. Dolores was arrested on a Thursday morning at Raymond's house while she was standing in the kitchen making coffee. She was in her robe and slippers. She was not expecting company. She did not go quietly. She told the officers they had no right to be there. She told them Vivienne had fabricated the entire thing out of years of jealousy and spite. She told them Raymond would make some calls and get this corrected before it went any further. She was still talking when the patrol car reached the end of the driveway and turned onto the main road. The trial lasted 4 days. Dolores's attorney argued that the tonic was purchased at a legitimate health store and that his client had no knowledge of its actual contents. He argued that the sedative in Vivienne's system could have entered her body through any number of other means. He argued that Vivienne was a resentful stepdaughter with a long history of conflict who had engineered this entire situation to destroy a devoted woman who had sacrificed years of her life caring for a sick husband and a hostile family. He said it all very confidently. The prosecution called a pharmacology expert who explained in plain and precise language exactly what had been found in that bottle and why it was a scientific impossibility for it to occur through any natural or accidental process. They submitted the phone records. They submitted the bank records. They called the man with the pharmaceutical fraud conviction, who had entered into an agreement with the state in exchange for his testimony. He sat in the witness box and testified that Dolores had contacted him 6 weeks before the wedding. He testified that she had paid him $900 in cash. He testified that she had told him she needed something that would put a person completely out of action for at least 12 hours without leaving obvious evidence of intent. He testified that he had provided exactly that. The courtroom went so quiet you could hear the air conditioning running in the ceiling above the gallery. Dolores sat at the defense table with her hands folded and her expression completely flat. Not sorry. Not afraid. Not even particularly concerned. Flat. Like a woman who had calculated all the outcomes and still believed, even now, that she was the smartest person in any room she entered. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 41 minutes. They returned a verdict of guilty on every single count. Criminal poisoning. Intentional grievous bodily harm. Elder financial fraud for the property transfer. Forgery on the document Raymond had signed while confused and trusting and utterly unaware of what he was putting his name to. The judge sentenced Dolores to 11 years in a state correctional facility. As the officers moved toward her at the defense table, Dolores stood and turned. She looked across the courtroom directly at Vivienne, who was seated in the gallery, completely still, her hands folded in her lap, her face giving away absolutely nothing. Dolores did not look sorry. She looked furious. Burning, unrepentant, absolute fury radiating off her like heat. Even now, even with 11 years stretching out in front of her like a road she had not chosen, as if the verdict were the injustice and not a single thing she had ever done. Vivienne looked back at her without flinching and without blinking. She held that gaze until Dolores was escorted through the side door and it closed behind her. The fraudulent property transfer was overturned by court order. The house was returned to Raymond. He held Vivienne's hand in the attorney's office while the papers were signed and the house moved back into the family where it belonged. And he kept saying he was sorry. He said it differently each time, cycling through the versions as if searching for the one with enough weight to land. Vivienne listened to all of it. She did not rush him. She did not tell him it was fine. But she stayed. She held his hand and she stayed. She and Marcus rescheduled the wedding for the following spring. It was smaller this time, 60 people instead of 214. A church with good light and an outdoor reception in someone's backyard with string lights and food that tasted like it had been made by people who loved you. Raymond came in a wheelchair because his health had continued to fail, but he was there. He was in the same navy suit. He cried from the moment Vivienne appeared at the back of the church, and he did not stop until they were seated together at the reception. He walked her down the aisle slowly, the wheelchair moving through the complete silence of a room full of people who understood exactly what it had cost both of them to arrive at this moment. Vivienne held his hand the entire length of that aisle. She did not let go until she absolutely had to. Raymond died 14 months after the wedding. He died in his father's house, which was now his daughter's house, in the bed he had slept in for 40 years. Vivienne was beside him. She held his hand until there was no longer a hand to hold. Dolores was still in prison. The house belongs to Vivienne now. She and Marcus go back every summer. She keeps the garden along the south side of the house, the one her grandmother planted decades ago. Roses mostly, heavy-headed and stubborn and wildly alive. She cuts them herself and puts them in jars on every windowsill and on the kitchen table where Dolores once sat eating her food and wearing her jewelry while she lay unconscious in a hospital bed. She told a reporter once that she does not spend time thinking about Dolores anymore. She said she thought about her constantly in the years when Dolores had power over her, and she has absolutely no interest in continuing that arrangement now that she does not. She said what she thinks about instead, when she is out in that garden with her hands in the soil, is her mother. The woman who died when she was 7. The woman who used to hum over the kitchen sink on Sunday mornings. She said she gardens the way her mother hummed. Without an audience. Without a reason. Just because it is the one thing that makes the world feel exactly the right size. The girl who grew up being made to feel like a burden in her own home now owns the home. The woman who was told there was nothing behind her quiet except damage turned out to be the most dangerous thing Dolores ever underestimated. The house, the land, the table, the chairs, every rose in that garden, all of it hers. Justice does not always arrive on schedule, but when it finally comes, it does not leave anything behind. If the story moved you, share it right now with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you are in your own season of being overlooked, underestimated, or betrayed by someone who was supposed to love you, hear this clearly. Your story is not finished. The woman who endures quietly is not weak. She is gathering herself. And when the time comes, she will rise in a way that no one who ever tried to diminish her will ever forget. Subscribe to Fireside Tales, because every day we sit down together and we tell the stories that remind us exactly who we are.